Driving alone at night had never bothered me before, but this road had something different about it. Something wrong. The fog rolled in suddenly, as thick as smoke, swallowing up the world outside my windshield. My headlights barely pierced the murk, illuminating only a few feet of the narrow, winding road ahead. Everything beyond that was just gone, like it had ceased to exist. I could barely see where I was going, and a gnawing dread settled in my chest. It wasn't long before I realized I didn't recognize this road at all. It should have been a straightforward drive, a route I'd taken dozens of times, but none of it looked familiar. The trees loomed high on either side of the road, their branches reaching out over the pavement like twisted, skeletal fingers. There were no street signs, no mile markers, just an endless ribbon of foggy asphalt winding off into the darkness. I kept driving, hoping that eventually the fog would lift and I'd find my way back to something familiar. But as the minutes dragged on, I began to notice something strange. I'd pass what looked like the same bend in the road over and over again, like I was caught in some twisted loop. I could swear I'd already seen that twisted oak tree with the branch that looked like a claw. The further I went, the more it felt like I wasn't moving forward at all, just driving in circles. That's when I saw the hitchhiker. At first, I thought it was just a shadow in the fog, but as I got closer, I could make out a figure standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched. Something about the person seemed off. They were hunched, draped in an old, tattered coat, their head lowered so I couldn't see their face. For a moment, I considered stopping. Maybe they were lost too, stuck on this godforsaken road with no end in sight. But as I slowed down, the figure lifted its head, and my stomach twisted. The face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, speeding past them without a second glance. My heart pounded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, that their eyes were following my car as it disappeared into the fog. A few minutes later, I saw them again. The same hitchhiker, standing by the side of the road, thumb out, face shrouded in shadows. But this time they were closer to the road, their arm extended farther, as if reaching for me. My hands tightened on the wheel as I drove past, refusing to even look their way. This was impossible. There was no way they could have gotten ahead of me. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, I kept seeing them again and again, each time closer to the road, each time more menacing. Eventually, the fog thickened even more, making it almost impossible to see anything. I had to slow down, my headlights barely cutting through the mist. And then, just as I rounded a bend, the hitchhiker was standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. My headlights illuminated the figure fully for the first time, and I wished they hadn't. The hitchhiker's skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Their eyes were black pits, staring at me with an unnatural intensity. They didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, blocking my way. I didn't dare get out of the car. Instead, I threw it in reverse, backing up as quickly as I could. But the fog was so thick I could barely see behind me. When I looked forward again, the hitchhiker was gone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, but the relief was short-lived. My headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, the hitchhiker was standing right next to my window, their face pressed against the glass, eyes staring directly into mine. I screamed, throwing the car into drive and slamming my foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding down the road, but I could still feel their eyes on me, could still see their face burned into my vision. I didn't dare look in the mirrors, terrified that I'd see them sitting in the back seat, grinning that horrible, hollow grin. The road seemed endless, stretching on and on with no sign of escape. My phone had no signal, the radio was just static, and the fog was so thick I couldn't even see the stars. I was completely and utterly alone. Just when I thought I'd never escape, I saw a light up ahead. It was faint, barely visible through the fog, but it was there. I sped toward it, desperate for any sign of civilization, any escape from the nightmare road. The light turned out to be an old gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. The place looked abandoned, the windows cracked, the paint peeling, but I didn't care. I pulled up to the pump, threw the car into park, and stumbled out, desperate for human contact, for any sign that I wasn't alone. But as I approached the door, I realized something was very wrong. The fog seemed to press in around me, thickening until I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. And then, through the haze, I saw them, the hitchhiker standing inside the gas station, watching me through the glass with those same hollow, empty eyes. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the hitchhiker just smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. They raised a hand and beckoned, inviting me inside. I shook my head, stumbling back to my car, but when I turned around, the hitchhiker was standing directly behind me, blocking my path. Their face was inches from mine, those hollow eyes staring into my soul. "Stay with us?" they whispered, their voice barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. I bolted, jumping into my car and locking the doors. I started the engine, but when I looked up, the hitchhiker was gone. I didn't question it. I just drove, speeding away from the gas station as fast as I could. The road stretched on, winding through the fog, and I could still feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. I just kept driving, hoping against hope that I'd eventually find my way out. But as I rounded the next bend, my heart sank. There, standing in the middle of the road, was the hitchhiker, waiting for me with that same hollow grin. And then I understood. There was no escape from this road, no end to the fog, no way out. I was trapped, doomed to drive this endless, nightmarish loop forever, with the hitchhiker always waiting, always watching, always smiling. As the fog closed in around me, swallowing the world whole, I realized with a sickening certainty that I'd never see the light of day again. I'd been driving for hours when the fog crept in, first like wisps of smoke curling around the edges of my headlights, then slowly thickening until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. It was eerie, unnatural, even how suddenly it had appeared. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 1:13 a.m. The highway should have been deserted, but even in the heavy fog, it felt like I wasn't alone. After a few more miles of navigating blindly, I came across a sign partially hidden in the mist, pointing to a detour. Raven's Hollow, it read in faded letters. The fog was making it impossible to see the main road, so I figured I'd take the detour and rejoin the highway a bit later on. The road to Raven's Hollow was narrow and winding, bordered on each side by tall, dark trees that seemed to lean over the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. With every twist and turn, my nerves frayed a little more. The fog was relentless, heavy as smoke, thickening until it felt like it was pressing in from all sides. Even the trees looked blurred, like shadows stretching into strange, twisting forms. After a while, I started to notice something odd. There were no sounds, no rustling of animals in the woods, no insects, not even the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. Just silence. It was unnerving, like the fog had swallowed everything alive. Then, just at the edge of my headlights, something flickered. A pale figure, barely visible before disappearing back into the mist. My heart skipped, and I instinctively pressed down on the accelerator. But as I rounded the next corner, the figure appeared again, closer this time, standing right on the edge of the road. It was a woman or something that looked like one. Her face was turned down, hidden by a mess of tangled, wet hair, and her body was wrapped in some kind of tattered white dress that clung to her as if it were damp. She didn't move, didn't even flinch as my car drew closer. I swerved to avoid her, barely keeping control of the car. When I looked in my rearview mirror, she was gone, but my pulse raced, and a chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. A few minutes later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing directly in the middle of the road, and I had no choice but to slam on the brakes. My car skidded to a halt, tires screeching against the pavement. She was only a few feet from my hood, and this time I got a good look at her face. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes wide and hollow, and her mouth stretched open as if in a silent scream. I stared at her, frozen, too terrified to move. She tilted her head, her eyes boring into mine through the windshield, and then, with a slow, unnatural motion, she raised her hand and pointed down the road. My instincts screamed at me to turn the car around and get out of there, but I couldn't. My hands felt glued to the steering wheel, my body paralyzed. I couldn't look away from her empty, hollow gaze. Then, without a sound, she lowered her arm and stepped to the side, vanishing into the fog like she'd never been there. With trembling hands, I pressed down on the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that horrifying apparition. But no matter how fast I drove, the road seemed endless, stretching on and on through the fog with no sign of the highway, no hint of civilization. The trees seemed closer now, closing in from all sides, and the fog grew thicker, making it hard to even breathe. That's when I noticed the road signs. They were old, rusty, and completely unfamiliar. Each one marked the distance to Raven's Hollow, but the numbers on the signs didn't make sense. The last one I passed read, Raven's Hollow, 5 miles, but after another mile or so, I saw a new sign that read Raven's Hollow, 8 miles. It was as if the town was getting farther away the more I drove toward it. I kept going, hoping the fog would clear, hoping I'd see some sign of life, but the road just seemed to loop back on itself. Every turn felt like déjà vu, like I'd been driving the same stretch over and over. At one point, I passed a broken-down car on the side of the road, its door hanging open, and an uneasy thought crossed my mind. Had that car been there the last time I'd passed? I wanted to stop, to see if someone needed help, but something about that car felt wrong. 2. The fog had seeped inside, covering the seats and dashboard with a thin layer of moisture, as if it had been abandoned for years. And then I saw it, sitting in the driver's seat. A small, delicate pendant hanging from the rearview mirror, swaying gently. It was an old, tarnished locket, shaped like a heart, with initials engraved on it, Mul. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the fog was tightening its grip. My head was pounding, and I could swear I felt eyes watching me from the shadows beyond the trees. Then the woman appeared again, standing next to the abandoned car, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She lifted her hand once more, pointing down the road, but this time her face was twisted, her mouth open in a wide, unnatural grin that sent ice through my veins. I couldn't take it anymore. I hit the gas, swerving around the abandoned car and speeding down the road as fast as I could. The fog was everywhere, pressing against my windows, filling the air with a damp, heavy chill. I kept driving, my heart pounding, praying I'd see the highway or some sign of life. But no matter how far I went, the road never changed. The fog never lifted, and every few miles, I'd see the same sign for Raven's Hollow, the distance never quite right. It was like I was trapped in some kind of twisted loop, doomed to drive this foggy, haunted road forever. Then, as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road. My stomach dropped. It was me, my own car, headlights blazing, sitting dead center in the road. And in the driver's seat, I could see myself, staring blankly forward, pale and lifeless, a hollow look in my eyes. The fog wrapped tighter around me, and as I slammed on the brakes, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, a whisper in my ear, a voice that sounded just like mine, low and hollow, whispering, "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," and then everything went dark. It was supposed to be a quick drive home, just a routine trip on a foggy night, but I hadn't anticipated how thick the fog would become. It rolled in like waves, blanketing everything in a dense, ghostly white that swallowed the road. I could barely see past my own headlights, and even the dashboard lights seemed dim, as if the fog was pressing in from all sides, trying to invade every corner of the car. I was alone on the road, or at least I thought I was. But as the minutes passed, the fog took on an almost suffocating presence, and I began to feel that unsettling prickling at the back of my neck, the unmistakable sense that someone or something was watching me. The road twisted and turned through the trees, and every now and then I'd see shapes in the fog, fleeting and indistinct, hovering at the edge of my vision. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes, but it didn't help the creeping feeling of dread growing in my chest. Then I saw it, a faint figure, barely visible, standing on the side of the road. A woman, or at least what looked like a woman, wearing a long, dark dress. She had no face, or maybe it was there, but hidden beneath a veil of fog. My heart raced as I passed her, my fingers tightening on the wheel. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. Just as my headlights swept over her, I thought I saw her lift her head and stare straight at me, her eyes hollow and dark. I hit the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever she was. But as I rounded the next bend, she was there again, standing just as before, as if she'd somehow moved faster than I could drive, waiting for me up ahead. I felt my hands start to shake. "Calm down," I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breath. "It's just the fog. It's just shadows." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that the road itself was trapping me, that every turn was leading me deeper into some kind of twisted maze. Then, I noticed something strange about the road signs. They were old, rusty, and warped, with the words barely visible. The last one had read Hollow Point 5 miles, but this one said Hollow Point 7 miles. I'd been driving for what felt like hours, yet the town I was trying to reach seemed to be getting farther away, not closer. My gas gauge was dropping fast, and I knew I had to find help soon, or I'd be stranded. I turned onto a narrower road, hoping it might lead me somewhere safer. The trees seemed denser here, looming over the road like silent sentinels. The fog clung to them, creating twisted shapes that seemed to reach out with bony fingers. I tried not to look too closely at the trees, but something caught my eye, a figure standing just a few feet off the road. It was her again, the same woman, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. But this time, she was closer, close enough that I could see her face clearly. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over her skull, her eyes dark and endless. I drove faster, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But no matter how far I went, she was always there. Every turn, every straightaway, she stood waiting, her gaze locked onto me, as if daring me to keep going. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw lights up ahead, a faint glow cutting through the fog. I sped toward them, desperate for any sign of life, any escape from this cursed road. The lights led me to an old, run-down gas station. It looked abandoned, the paint peeling, windows dusty and broken. But the lights were on, flickering weakly, casting eerie shadows over the building. I pulled in, relieved just to be out of the endless fog. But as I stepped out of the car, I felt the temperature drop. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and an unnatural silence settled around me. I walked up to the door, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and pushed it open. Inside, the shelves were bare, covered in a layer of dust, and the entire place felt frozen in time. I called out, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the fog that had somehow seeped inside, clinging to the corners of the room. That's when I noticed the photographs on the wall behind the counter. They were old, black and white, showing people who looked like they'd been caught in mid-laughter, mid-conversation. But as I looked closer, my heart stopped. In each photo, there was a familiar face. A pale, hollow-eyed woman in a dark dress, staring directly at the camera, her gaze piercing through the years, through the glass, and straight into me. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was looking at. She'd been here long ago, and now, somehow, I was trapped in her world. I turned to leave, but the fog was so thick I could barely see the door. And then I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the fog, echoing around the empty gas station. "Stay with me." My blood turned to ice. I bolted out the door, practically throwing myself back into my car. As I started the engine, I could see her again in my rearview mirror, standing at the gas station entrance, watching me with that empty, soulless gaze. I sped out of there, praying the road would lead me back to the highway, back to something familiar. But the fog was thicker than ever, and every turn seemed to twist back on itself, leading me in endless circles. The woman was everywhere, on the side of the road, in the shadows of the trees, even in the mirror, her hollow eyes following me. Finally, I saw another sign, but it only deepened my terror. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Point," in faded, peeling letters. And below it, a chilling phrase, "Population U." The fog closed in, swallowing the road, the trees, everything. And then I heard it again, that whisper, closer now, inside the car, like a breath against my ear. "Stay. You'll never leave." I looked around frantically, but I was alone, completely terrifyingly alone. Or so I thought. In the rearview mirror, just behind me in the back seat, I saw her face, grinning wide, her eyes hollow and endless, as the fog consumed everything. The fog settled in thickly as I drove down the old country road. The mist was so dense that I could barely see beyond the reach of my headlights, which were doing little more than carving out a tunnel of visibility through the haze. It was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the low hum of my car and the sound of my own breathing. I'd taken this road before, but tonight, something felt different. Every twist and turn seemed unfamiliar, like the road was winding and stretching in ways I didn't remember. Trees loomed on either side, their branches tangled like claws reaching into the fog. It was almost like they were leaning in, closing around me, keeping me on this isolated, endless path. The further I drove, the denser the fog became. I was starting to feel as if I were driving underwater, every inch a struggle against the silent, pressing mist. I glanced at the clock, surprised by how much time had passed without me reaching anything recognizable. This route should have led me back to the main road by now, but all I'd seen were miles of dark trees and walls of fog. Then, in the distance, I noticed something, a faint glow in the mist. It was barely there, but it was the first sign of life I'd seen for hours. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, hoping it was another car, maybe someone else lost on this godforsaken road. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car. It was a house. The house stood back from the road, partially hidden by the thick fog and shadowed trees. It looked old, abandoned even. Its windows were dark, and the wood was peeling and weathered. But despite its decayed appearance, a single light flickered in the window, a pale, sickly glow that seemed to pulse as though it were alive. I don't know what possessed me to stop, but something about the house called to me. I pulled over, heart pounding as I opened the door. The air outside was even colder than inside the car, and the silence was even more oppressive. I took a step forward, the ground soft and damp beneath my feet. The light in the window grew brighter, beckoning me closer. I should have felt afraid, but instead, I felt a strange calm, like I was being pulled by invisible strings. The mist thickened around me, swallowing the car behind me until it disappeared from view. I was completely alone, stranded in a world of fog and silence. As I approached the house, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the still air. The inside was dark, except for that single pulsing light coming from somewhere deep within. I hesitated on the porch, listening to the sounds of the night, except there were none. Not even the distant rustling of leaves or the creak of branches. Just silence. I pushed the door open, and it groaned as it swung inward, revealing a dim hallway. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, faded and worn, as though no one had lived here in years. But the light continued to beckon me, drawing me deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way down the hall. Every step echoed in the silence, each sound swallowed up by the thick fog that had somehow seeped inside. The light was coming from a room at the end of the hall, flickering in an erratic rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to go inside, but something inside me compelled me to. I turned the handle slowly, the door swinging open with a low creak. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair, and in that chair sat a figure shrouded in darkness, their face hidden beneath a hood. They didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there motionless, with their hands folded neatly in their lap. The light was coming from a lantern on the floor beside them, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure lifted their head, and I saw their face. A face that was neither young nor old, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to look straight through me. "You shouldn't be here," they whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I got lost," I stammered, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. "I was just trying to find my way back." The figure tilted their head, as if considering my words. Their lips twisted into a faint smile, one that didn't reach their hollow eyes. "There is no way back," they murmured. "Not for you." I took a step back, my skin prickling with a cold dread that seeped deep into my bones. The figure didn't move, didn't react. They just sat there, watching me with that empty, unblinking stare. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I turned, my hands fumbling in the pitch black as I stumbled out of the room and back down the hall. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in from all sides, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I made it back to the front door, flinging it open and bursting out onto the porch. But when I stepped outside, I froze. The car was gone, and in its place was an endless expanse of fog, stretching out in every direction. The road, the trees, Everything had disappeared, leaving me stranded in a world of mist and silence. I ran, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the fog, but no matter how far I went, the house was always there, looming in the distance, the light flickering in the window like a beacon, drawing me back. I don't know how long I've been here. Hours? Days? Time has no meaning in this place. The house is always there, waiting for me, and the figure in the chair is always watching, their hollow eyes following me wherever I go. I am trapped, lost in a fog that never lifts, on a road that leads nowhere. The world I knew is gone, replaced by this endless, silent void. And I know deep down that there is no escape. I am doomed to wander these foggy roads forever, a prisoner of the mist, haunted by the figure in the chair and the flickering light that will never go out. The road twisted and turned ahead, barely visible beneath the dense fog swallowing my headlights. It was supposed to be a shortcut, just a quick detour to shave off some time from my late-night drive back home. But now, every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way, even if it meant driving all night. The fog wrapped around everything, thick as smoke, swallowing up the world outside the narrow glare of my headlights. The road looked less like pavement and more like a forgotten trail, barely wide enough for my car to fit. In that silence, a stillness lay heavy in the air, as if I were entering somewhere I didn't belong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees loomed on either side, their branches twisting together above to form an almost tunnel-like canopy, each shadow stretching and shifting, playing tricks on my tired mind. The fog only thickened, narrowing my vision to the few feet in front of me, with no sounds of wildlife, no rustling leaves, only the faint hum of my engine and my heartbeat pounding in my chest. Then, in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a flash of something darting just outside the beam of my headlights. I shook my head, forcing my eyes back on the road, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A figure, thin, too thin, with a face obscured by the shadows, its eyes catching the faintest glint of light as I passed. My stomach dropped, and my foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas. I didn't dare look back. The car lurched forward, engine whining as I pushed it faster and faster, hoping to leave whatever that thing was far behind me. But the fog seemed to thicken, and every bend in the road felt like it was leading me further and further from safety. A few minutes passed, and the fog finally thinned just enough that I could see a small sign ahead. Relief washed over me, but it quickly faded when I squinted and realized the words were nearly worn away. It was one of those old-fashioned road signs, cracked and faded, like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The sign pointed left, toward something called Fallow Creek. I'd never heard of it before, but the moment my headlights hit the sign, I felt the chill return, colder this time, like something had sunk claws into my spine. I kept driving, hoping the fog would lift soon and I'd see some sign of civilization. That was when the road abruptly ended in front of me. The gravel gave way to cracked pavement, and I found myself at the edge of a desolate, abandoned town. The buildings looked ancient, with boarded-up windows and roofs collapsing inward. The fog coiled around them, giving the whole town a ghostly, submerged feel, like I'd driven into some forgotten memory of a place. I wanted to turn around and leave, but some strange compulsion forced me to keep going, to see what lay beyond the silent buildings. I parked near an old gas station, its pumps rusted and peeling, covered in grime. Something about the place felt wrong, out of sync with time itself. I scanned my surroundings, half expecting someone, or something, to step out from the fog. That's when I heard it, a faint, low humming noise. It didn't sound like machinery or the wind. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant, so soft it was nearly swallowed by the fog. I froze, listening as the sound grew closer, each word unintelligible, but chilling all the same. Then, I noticed something glinting on the ground, just a few feet away. It was a trail of broken glass, leading away from the gas station and toward the town center. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight in my car, flicking it on and following the broken glass, curiosity overpowering my better judgment. My footsteps echoed in the silence, mingling with that eerie humming. Every building I passed seemed to lean toward me, watching with hollow, empty windows. The glass trail led to a small square in the center of town, where a lone statue stood, covered in moss and grime. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially eroded by time, with hands raised as if in a silent plea. But what caught my attention wasn't the statue. It was the figure standing beside it. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person standing perfectly still. I aimed my flashlight toward them, but the fog seemed to absorb the light, making it impossible to see their face. The humming stopped, and for a few agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the figure came closer. With each step, the fog lifted just enough to reveal more of them. A pale, ashen face, eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and hands that looked too long, too thin, almost skeletal. They stopped just a few feet from me, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I saw their face fully. It was twisted, hollowed out, as if they were wearing the mask of a person rather than being one. Their mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only that same low humming I'd heard before, now filling my ears and drowning out my thoughts. I finally managed to break free from my paralysis and stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The fog seemed to follow me, pressing closer, suffocating me. I reached my car, flung open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands shook as I turned the key, praying the engine would start. When it finally did, I sped out of there, not daring to slow down until the fog was far behind me. The road eventually led me back to the main highway, and as I merged onto it, I allowed myself to look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road. I never found that road again, despite driving the same route many times since that night. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a thin, twisted figure watching from the edge of the mist, and I feel that humming, faint and distant, filling the air around me, as if waiting for me to take that turn back into Fallow Creek.